Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for welcoming me here today. My name's Julie Fairfield, and I'm joining you from Te Awa Kairangi, the Hutt Valley, where I grew up and where I'm raising my family. And I want to acknowledge Te Aotearoa, the mana whenua of this place. We're here today to talk about how we can use narratives and frames to build support for the changes we know we need so that everyone in Aotearoa has a decent home, a place that's warm and dry, accessible, and offers security and stability. Decent homes allow people to contribute to and participate in our communities. They allow people to work, they keep kids in schools, and decent homes keep our people healthy. So this is why we're here today. But first, I'll do a very quick introduction of the workshop. So we're a small public good organisation, and we focus on researching and then teaching people evidence-based ways to talk about complex issues. And the reason we do that is so people understand and then support the changes that will make the biggest difference to the planet. We're based in Whanganui Atara, and we work on a whole range of issues from crime and justice, poverty, anti-racism, transport, climate, and of course housing. And we're doing a long project with the Wellington Regional Healthy Housing Group, and really excited to share some of this work with you today. It's really important to state that we present our findings and advice, understanding that there are many different ways of knowing, and believing that together these offer us the greatest potential for building better systems. So it's our intention that the work that we do isn't treated as the answer, but rather a useful and helpful lens to approaching how we talk about the big issues of our time. And we hope that people can and will use our tools in ways that make sense in the context of their own ways of knowing. So you all are working towards decent homes and decent homes for everyone. So you will know that making these changes that we need is not always the easiest path. Transforming our systems and structures needs public support. And without public understanding and support, those structural policy shifts we need are really hard to achieve and even harder to sustain. So the big question is, how can we deepen most people's understanding about decent homes and build support for the changes that will make the biggest difference? And we've found that the science of mindsets, narratives, and framing can really help. Many of you will be familiar with direct advocacy. This is one-on-one or lobbying work that focuses directly on influencing decision makers, like politicians or funders, to make the changes we need. Now, advocacy is a really important role in how change happens for public good. However, when we're working for long-term systemic changes and changes that require the public to make quite a shift in how they think and experience the world, we know that direct advocacy isn't enough. So the people who make decisions that affect us all make them on behalf of others, and they need to know that they have the support of those others to have the social license to push through those changes. Now, in his book, Strategy and Soul, Daniel Hunter uses a metaphor of a rock and a balloon to explain the importance of building public support and understanding for changes. So in this metaphor, politicians are like a balloon tied to a rock. If we swat at them or pull at them, they may move to the left or to the right, but tied down, they can only go so far. And in this metaphor, the rope is really important because it shows the relationship between the ability for those politicians to move and the tethered to the public that they represent. You can move that decision maker a little way using party or personal values, but they can only ever go as far as the rope allows. So if we want to get sustained and effective change, we need to work together to move the rock by building the public understanding and support. And when we move that rock, it automatically pulls the decision makers towards our vision without having to move each one separately. This kind of shift of thinking makes the old position politically unacceptable and the new position easier to sustain. And we see this playing out in our media often. And we've seen it recently with Pharmac and the government providing more funding for cancer medicines after fairly substantial public outcry. We also saw it in action with the proposed changes to funding of school lunches, and those changes were watered down because the public had shown that that wasn't acceptable to them. And we're seeing it play out right now in your sector, and I've got just a couple of examples to show it to you in action. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the proposed changes to the installation standards. And so I've got just a couple of examples of how narrative and framing can really impact that balloon and rock um, dynamic. So in this example, we see an expert, in this case it's the certified builders, talk about changing H1 standards would be a backward step. So it's a really obvious articulation of the rock has already moved. And I've got another example here, which is another way of saying the same thing, also from someone active in the area, saying that the horse is bolted. This is another way of reinforcing to those decision makers that the rock of public support has shifted and they're not keeping up in the right place. And finally, in this particular story, this is a spin-off story, you can see the voice of someone who rents, the person who is most affected by the changes. And they're quoted saying that those standards really highlighted that renters' basic rights to warm, dry, safe housing weren't being met, and that landlords have the responsibility to keep their tenants healthy. The quote also points out that the standards are the bare minimum. So you can see this conversation playing out in the media right now. And what those decision makers need to see is the public, as well as the experts, want and need those standards to stay in place. And what this does is it puts pressure on their social license to make the change. Now, it's really important to note that this is a long-term strategy and there may be bumps in the road. We may not win this time, but it's incredibly important that we work hard now to shift how the people think and then reflect that really loudly and clearly to decision makers, because that has a big influence in how they are able to make change. So if that's what we're trying to achieve, how do we do it? How do we go about it? Well, we draw on the work from Kania and colleagues, and that can really help us. Now, across the housing sector, there are people and organisations working at all levels shown in this triangle. To effect change in policies, resources and practices, we need to build on relationships and connections. We need to understand the power dynamics. And importantly, for the work that we do, we need to address the mindsets that hold the current system in place. And today we're focusing on the bottom of that triangle, the mindsets. And this is because our mindsets shape what we see as normal or a problem in the world and how our society is structured. Our mindsets shape our willingness to support changes and ultimately the success of their implementation. So what's really interesting and relevant to us is people that create communications. And by that, I mean people, all of us create communications, not just people that have comms in their job title, is the role we can play in influencing those mindsets. And mindsets are part of our culture, and we get them from the places we spend our time. So we get it through news and entertainment media, through information in our families, in our schools, and community groups. So this is exciting because if that's where our mindsets come from, it gives us some clues in how we might take action to influence how people think and reason about decent homes. So narratives are the pattern of meaning built up through stories, words, and pictures. They help us make sense of the world, organise information, and make meaning in different contexts. They're like a golden thread that's woven through all the different ways that we collect communications. And people often use the words story and narrative interchangeably. And in our work, it's good to understand that they mean different things. And an easy way of understanding or remembering that is that a story is told, but a narrative is understood. So the narrative is the pattern that the stories create. And the last technical term I want to introduce that makes sense of how this way of working works is framing. Framing is the tool we use to shift the narrative. So the choices we make and how we present an issue influences how people talk about the issue, the narrative, and how people think and reason about the issue, their mindsets. So this is really exciting. As communicators, this is our tool to use. We can use our framing to switch on helpful ways of thinking about decent homes. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how that framing works. First, what do you see? This is an optical illusion, And we share it now because some of you will see a vase, others of you might see a face or two faces. Most of you, once I've pointed it out, will be able to see both. But importantly, you won't be able to see both at the same time. And much like we can think about or see an issue quite differently, we can't see both different ways at the same time. And what frames do, and the act of framing does, is it works to activate the different ways we have of seeing an issue. And this is because of our psychology. So this phenomenon of switching on or off different ways of thinking or seeing comes because of the neurological associations that are connected with different frames. So our minds connect the frame we use to present an issue with a specific way of thinking about that issue. So this is something we can harness and use to help people understand through the frames that we use. And there are many different ways that we can frame an issue. And words are really powerful. And actually, single word frames aren't on this slide, but there are some that I want to draw your attention to. So when we think about the neurological associations we have with a particular word or a frame, think about the difference in how you think about and feel when you say housing stock versus housing supply. How it feels different when you say houses compared to homes. And the difference when talking about renters versus talking about whānau that rent. Now, just really simple word changes can make quite a big difference in how we start thinking about an issue and the explanations and understandings that that can raise for us. So this is exciting because we can be intentional about the frames that we use. And it's important to understand that the relationship between mindsets, narratives, and framing is dynamic and multi-directional. Nothing's ever static. So the way that we talk influences how we think influences how we talk, and institutions and organizations have a role in that too. So it's really interesting to think of this as a dynamic building thing that we can influence and strengthen to work in our favor.